I'm Ari Goldstein, and along with my colleague Sydney Yeager, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. We're kicking off this evening's Legacies program with Moderna's Chief Medical Officer, Tal Zaks, to whom we all owe a great debt of gratitude for being with us today, and of course for his life-saving work to develop Moderna's mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. This Legacies program is made possible with a gift from Mark Kirshner in honor of Nancy Fisher. Tal is in conversation today with Mattie Kahn, the culture director at Glamour magazine and the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Mattie is currently writing a book about teen girls and activism titled Young and Restless for Viking Books, and you can find more of her work on Twitter and Substack. During Tal and Mattie's discussion this evening, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded, and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. Without further ado, welcome Tal and Mattie. Feel free to get started.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. Yes. And wow, there is an astounding number of people who are watching this, so I'll try to keep it interesting. I know that probably many of the people who are here want to hear about what you've been up to over the past year and a bit, but let's start a little bit farther back. I'm curious to hear how you got interested in medicine in the first place and whether you ever considered doing something else besides saving all of our lives with record-breaking, worldwide, amazing vaccines.
Well, first, you're too kind, and thank you for agreeing to share the podium with me this evening. Yeah, in a funny way, I think medicine was my rebellion. I grew up to a father who was a mathematician. In fact, his two brothers are also mathematicians, and logic was the all-prevailing, course of action, if you will. And when I was growing up, I was curious, always surrounded by scientific thinking and deep logic, but curious to see the impact that had on humanity, on actual people. And so for me, it sort of became this escape, if you will, to something that had a more concrete impact.
Yeah, so I'm sure many people have made the joke to you that you were the lone Jewish boy whose parents weren't as excited that you went to become a doctor. But they probably dealt with it in the end, I'm guessing. I'm guessing they came around.
So it's funny you should ask. I think my mom's always been proud of the fact, typical Jewish mom. I think my dad came around to it. I think initially he thought I'd be, another mathematician. He was, I think, quite well regarded in his field. I'm sad to say that I probably don't understand most of what he did, but I know that he rose to some prominence and was well respected. But I think, as I became an adult and he saw what it was I was doing, I think he was very proud.
Yes, deservedly so. Well, you grew up in Israel, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and the difference that you felt in medicine in terms of coming here. But let's talk about that right now. When you came to the US, you came to study tumor immunology. What was the decision to come here to do research like, and how did it feel different from the way you'd experienced medicine, and particularly the human side of medicine in Israel?
So for me, it was a big choice at the time. So I studied medicine in Israel, but I was always curious about science. So I actually took a bit of a detour and spent a few years doing some research, ended up with an MD and a PhD in something that was then a backwaters of immunology called cancer immunology. And I had a wonderful opportunity to come and sort of explore it in much greater depth here at the National Institutes of Health with Steve Rosenberg. And at the time, I kind of felt like, the sky's the limit in this country. And Israel, while it has phenomenal training and phenomenal sciences, I felt that I would probably have the ability to do more here. And since as a kid, I had grown up sort of flip-flopping between the US and Israel because my father was one of these wandering academics, it was relatively easy for me. I have to say, I think my family paid a bigger price. My wife joined me, she's an Israeli, and came here together. And I promised her, if this doesn't work out in a couple of months, then we can always go back. And, that was some 25 years ago.
Yeah, famous last words. It sounds like you had mentors here and people who welcomed you in this scientific community. What was sort of, if you could articulate for your career the kind of prevailing wisdom that has driven you to pursue the different opportunities that you've pursued?
Well, I think I've been really fortunate. You've asked me about the practice of medicine here and in Israel. And there are some big cultural differences for how we train, at least back in the day, Israel being a much more paternalistic society, where, you go to the doctor, you expect him to give you the right answer. And what do you mean there can be three right answers depending on what the patient wants, right? That's in the US, it's very different. It's also, I remember when I started my internal medicine, so here I trained in Israel, and because I had trained for longer than most US graduates, and I did some extracurricular things like spending 4 years as a nurse in the intensive care unit while I was a medicine student, I came much more clinically prepared than most of my US colleagues. And so I remember the first week we had grand rounds and I thought it went fine. And then the second week I started in the ICU and, I ask a few questions. And at the end of rounds, my resident, the senior person, kind of pulls me in, closes the door and wags her finger at me and says, I put my eye on you. You're that intern who actually asked questions the first day on grand rounds. You don't do that. You first listen to your elders here, right? So, okay, I give Steve Rosenberg a lot of credit. I mean, translating science to medicine is probably something that I espouse to do based on him being a role model. And he, in that realm, he is one of the most legendary people that I've ever seen. And it's just been astounding to watch him and be able to train with him.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked a little bit about the differences in terms of the practice of medicine, asking questions, always, of course, being the Jewish way. So good on you for that. But on a personal level, moving here, how did it feel to sort of change your identity from being Israeli to having that be kind of hyphenated with being in America? And I'm curious too, since we're in this venue, how it felt also to have to redefine, if you did, your relationship to Judaism being in America and raising your kids here instead of in Israel.
So it's a very good question. I had thought about it long and hard because as a kid, I had experienced sort of Judaism in the US, which is very different from the experience in Israel. And it made me kind of realize that I think for many of us secular Jews growing up in Israel, the Holocaust was a point of rupture in our identity, in our collective identity. And if you look at it back, my grandparents who immigrated to Israel in the 30s, they actually, did something that their parents thought was crazy, and they left the religious way of life and they immigrated to this foreign country. My grandfather when he was 16, my grandma when she was, 20. And basically history proved them right in a very sad way. And I think that deep scar has meant that those of us who grew up second and third generation secular Jews in Israel kind of felt like being Jewish is being Israeli. It's one and the same. We don't need to go to the synagogue. Figuratively, once we land in Ben Gurion, we sort of kiss the figurative mezuzah and we're inside our own home. Whereas for American Jews, Judaism is not like an Israel and nationalistic identity. It's actually a religious one. And so Judaism has survived thanks to a religious identity. And coming back as an adult here, my wife Mirav was pregnant at the time. Our son was 4. Once we decided to stay, it became very clear to me that for them to continue this identity meant that I had to relinquish my sort of view on what Judaism is and actually embrace a more religious one. And so we sent our kids to the Jewish day school system. They both graduated from Jewish high schools. And I think for them, the definition of Judaism is much more religious than it is for me. So I think on the family life, I've always been attuned to this subtle difference between Israelis and American Jews. And look, I have my grandma's brother immigrated to the US. And so I've got great cousins and a great aunt and a great uncle who live in DC. And we've been in touch over the years, and it's been phenomenal sort of to reconnect and understand what our identities are like. So that's at a personal level. I have to say that, professionally, it's been a somewhat more subtle experience. Being an Israeli, and being called Tal Zaks, within a nanosecond, people figure out, yeah, okay, we figure out who this guy is. And I've never made any bones about it. In fact, quite the contrary. I often embrace some of the Talmudic or Yiddish sayings, if you will, just as a way to joke and share my heritage. And I do it very openly. In the beginning of September, it's when companies typically make their long range plans, and it's always a very, very tough time. And I used to joke to people and say, look, these are the 10 terrible days. Yeah, let me tell you about that. We got some atonement to do here, right? And when another example that I've used is when we go in front of investors as a corporate spokesperson, we're supposed to read this forward-looking statement. And very quickly on, I remember I was in New York in a room full of bankers, and the slide flashes up, and I look at these guys and I say, look, let me explain this simply. What the slides means is really just a modern legalese interpretation of an old Talmudic saying that basically says, since the time of the temple was lost, all prophecy has been given to fools. So whatever I'm about to prophesy, I'm a fool. But if you listen to me, well, that's on you. And sort of, I've embraced those elements of cultural heritage and found a way to make them part of my life, right? When somebody does something foolish, the folks at Moderna have often heard me say, 50 wise men won't find the stone in a lake that some fool threw, and you've just thrown a stone in the lake, buddy. So what was funny to me is one day, one of my colleagues came up to me and said how proud she was that I was so proud of my Jewishness. And that really struck a chord for me, because I guess maybe as an Israeli, not growing up here, realizing that what I'm doing may be a little bit on the edge for some people in terms of, having my identity front and center, was not typical.
Yeah, it's funny because I always feel like, well, my name speaks for itself too, having a last name like Kahn, but you would be surprised how many people think it's Khan, and then they're expecting someone very different than who they get. But I think that makes sense. And I think one of the things that is interesting to me is like this idea of bringing your whole self to work and figuring out how you maintain, some level of distance from the thing that you do, and also throw your whole heart into it. In terms of your relationship to work, is there any piece of you that the people at Moderna would be surprised, any hobby they would be surprised to hear about? Or do you feel like this work has really been your life?
Oh, no, so as Marav will tell you quickly, one of the greatest difficulties I have is actually I enjoy what I do so much I have no hobbies. I mean, it got so bad that when I was starting, seriously, I was starting to prepare for leaving Moderna. She decided she needed to make me a play date and go find somebody to play with.
Okay, well, we wish you great luck on finding, maybe you can take up knitting or something in your free time. But in terms of, before we get to leaving Moderna, let's get to coming to Moderna. I know that you've said that mRNA research was one of the things that drew you to this job. Obviously, that proved to be a good investment, and something we are all grateful for. mRNA is a new term probably to many of us, or a term we have not heard since high school. So tell me about how you became interested in it and what you recognized as its potential in coming to Moderna.
So mRNA is that intermediary that every cell in our body uses to translate the genetic code into what that cell is supposed to be doing. All of the cells in our body have the same DNA, right? But every cell is different, or slightly different, or very different. I mean, just look at our body. We're made up of very different organs and very different cells. So the thing that makes every cell unique is the fact that they only produce part of the proteins that are instructed for in our DNA, and that part is dictated by the messenger RNA. So this has been known now for many years. It's called the central dogma of biology. As somebody whose life's mission has been to translate emerging science into medicine, when you come across a platform that has not yet been in the clinic, but purports to actually take that very essence of translation, as it's called, in the cell at the molecular level, and use it to teach every cell in the body or the relevant cells in the body to make a protein for a therapeutic intent, or in this case, a vaccine, that was just something I couldn't let go of. And so this was a little over 6 years ago when I first saw what Moderna was trying to do. The company had not yet put anything in the clinic, but just the question of, if this were to work, what were the things that we could make out of it was something I couldn't let go. At the time, I had a pretty nice job. I was running all of oncology for one of the major pharmaceutical companies, but I was turning 50, and a strange thing happens to you at a certain point in life. You stop looking for what's the next step, and you start counting your time in reverse. And the time that God's given me on this earth, what do I want to get done? And you realize that the questions you ask are important. And so for me, it was an opportunity to really join something that I thought was big. And I remember telling Marav at the time, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'd rather fail trying to do something really, really important than succeed on something that's relatively incremental.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all glad that you made that bet. I just want to say that I'm going to take a look at the Q&A section of the chat and of the Q&A function. So at a bit later on. So if people want to leave questions, don't worry, we will get to them. But in the meantime, I think that this way of almost as soon as these vaccines proved to be effective, as we were all following with, great curiosity, there was also the articles that we would see about what the potential for this kind of technology and this approach to therapeutics, what that could yield. For you, now that you joined Moderna and now you're seeing what the company is doing and what's going to come next, what is your hope for this approach to making vaccines?
So I think this is going to it already has revolutionized vaccines in terms of the potential. I think the safety and efficacy of the 2 mRNA vaccines that have been launched are astounding. People ask me, well, what's different between your vaccine and Pfizer? And I tell them, you're missing the real question. The important question is, how similar are they? In science, we're taught that we don't believe any experiment until it's replicated. And we've just seen the most astounding scientific replication, in my lifetime of these 2 vaccines, both demonstrating safety and efficacy now in hundreds of millions of people. I think there are other vaccines that will be developed, are already being developed for other infectious diseases. We're trying to leverage the power of this technology for cancer. That's a much more complicated problem. I don't know if we'll succeed, but we're certainly giving it our best shot. And then there are many other applications. Really, the breadth of what you can do with this is astounding. Our collaborators, AstraZeneca, are actually injecting the message that codes for a growth factor to repair the heart directly into the heart of people after they've had a myocardial infarct as a way to improve regeneration. We've got collaborators at another company, Vertex, who are trying to use messenger RNA by inhalation to replace a missing protein for children with cystic fibrosis in order to improve their lung functions. We at Moderna have already dosed young kids with hereditary errors of metabolism, as they're called, when they've got a problem in the gene that is encoding a critical enzyme. We're trying to replace that missing information just with messenger RNA. And when you give it IV, the hope is that it will go to their internal organs and teach them how to make that protein. So I think we're just at the cusp of a revolution of what you can do with mRNA. And it's a wonderful era because I think you're seeing these kinds of medicines. If you now step back and look at mRNA medicines, nucleotide medicine, gene therapy, et cetera, it's truly a remarkable era of the translation of science into medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think being at the cusp of this is so exciting. And I'm sure that many people look around at things that have become, ailments that we associate with modern life and wonder, what could potentially solve that problem or address that problem down the road. But I also think, as we all know, living in this information ecosystem, that the more new, amazing scientific breakthroughs that happen, the more the misinformation ecosystem sort of rises up to meet those innovations. And that's something that the vaccines have been the target of, you yourself have been the target of. I'm curious how you think that people in the policy space, people on the medicine and development side of things, can do as best as they can to communicate around stages of development of these different therapeutics, and how we can make sure that people understand these are safe, these are rigorously tested, nothing is being pulled out of a box and then handed to someone the next day.
So that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking over the past 18 months. As somebody who spent most of his career translating science into medicine, it was astounding to me to realize somewhat naively last year that if we don't translate that medicine into politics, and by politics, I don't mean it pejoratively. Politics is that which unites human beings to find shared meaning and do things for the greater good that we couldn't do alone. But if we don't translate what it is that we can accomplish into a language that people will understand broadly, then we will fail in the mission. And that realization, especially in the modern era of such divisive communication, has really been an interesting journey for me. It started when my mentor, my PhD mentor, the late Shraga Segal, taught me as I was doing what I thought was really complicated science at the time. He said, look, Tal, if you can't explain what you're doing to somebody in kindergarten, you don't really understand what you're doing, right? And that kind of stuck with me. As a physician, the toughest trick or skill that any physician needs to master is actually the ability to convey similar message in different languages to different people at different levels of comprehension. And I had no better teacher than Steve Rosenberg. Anybody who's seen Dr. Rosenberg with a patient knows immediately what I'm talking about. And yet here's somebody who is as steeped in the most complex science that we've ever done, has translated into cures for people with cancer, and yet finds a way to explain it to patients regardless where they come from. And I was fortunate to spend time with him. Coming back to sort of, as a pharmaceutical sponsor, it's been a struggle because while, I trust the veracity of the data that we're bringing forward, obviously, I understand that people don't intuitively trust me. And unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry over the years has become quite maligned in this country, despite the phenomenal progress we've done. And that's a paradox in and of itself. But as I've thought of, okay, how do you address that? I think we have a few simple tools. The first is to use plain language. I had the opportunity to, when I went back to Israel early this year, my sister-in-law asked me to go explain this vaccine to my nephew who's a 12-year-old. So I went and I spent an hour with these 12-year-olds thinking I'd tell them a story. Well, forget it. In 30 seconds, they started fidgeting, raising their hands, and they asked me questions. And let me tell you, they had great questions. And one of the questions was, well, so what about the side effects? Do people grow a tail when they get an mRNA vaccine? And I looked at the kid and I smiled.
I mean, wouldn't that be cool?
Right. So you know what I said? I said, look, I have to tell you, I have to investigate every such claim anywhere in the world. So whenever somebody thinks that happens, I ask them to drop their pants and show me. And so far, I haven't seen any tails. But if you see somebody, could you please let me know? Because I'd love to see it too, right? And so they all burst out laughing, obviously. More seriously, I think it's the personal example. So I talk about my mom getting vaccinated, my kids getting vaccinated. Of course, I was vaccinated. And then you try to leverage trusted voices in the community ultimately, because not everybody's going to trust me. But I do think that vaccine hesitancy is really just emblematic of the current political and public discourse we find ourselves, where there's no arena in our public life that we seem to have lost that Gaussian distribution of opinions into the extremes. And it's very hard to find middle ground these days. So I've really become interested in how conceptually can you actually engage people to find that common footing again. I think it's a problem that is much, much larger than vaccine hesitancy per se.
Yeah, and in this country, and that's another thing that I think is interesting in terms of your coming here, the American healthcare system has its own legacies of inequalities. It has, people across all ends of the political spectrum who have reason or feel they have reason to doubt vaccines for one reason or another. Getting steeped in that part of the culture, was any of that surprising to you, or is that something that you feel is a factor of healthcare, all over the world, or is that unique to this country?
Uh, I think there are elements that are unique to this country. Look, at the end of the day, this country was founded by people who believe in individualism and individual choice, right? It's one of the hallmarks of this great country, and it's certainly one of the reasons I'm here, if you look at my personal history. Um, when you have a culture that is so deep in individualistic right of determination, dealing with a pandemic where you do things for the greater good, yeah, that doesn't intuitively work, right? And so you see countries where a more homogeneous understanding of public good led them to more easily deal with the vaccine than I think in this country, and that's still ongoing. I respect people's right for self-determination. I respect people's right for making choices for their own. Um, I think that becomes really a difficult conversation when that right abuts on the danger to others. So I think if you don't want to get vaccinated, that's fine. But I think you can't not get vaccinated and expect to be able to go work in a nursing home, right? And go work in a hospital. So those are the kind of trade-offs that I think require some public dialogue, and it's been happening in this country. So overall, I'm actually optimistic.
Yeah. The vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, there were first developed so early in the pandemic. I'm curious if you can take us back to that moment where you first realized that this thing that had drawn you to this company was actually going to work, and then how it felt just on an emotional level to get through so many bad periods in the pandemic, knowing that this was on the way, and knowing that it wasn't ready to be rolled out right then.
Uh, well, it was an interesting journey. There were I remember within 48 hours of the vaccine sequence being known, we put the vaccine into production. Um, and I came home that night and told my wife, it started. And my wife, who happens to be not just an artist but also a biochemist, looked at me and said, "Yeah, one guy publishing the sequence in China. Are you sure you got it right?" And then for a second there, I started sweating, and I immediately called some people saying, "No, don't worry. It's been sequenced across the world. We got the right sequence." That being said, I still didn't completely sleep well until we saw first the mouse data proving that indeed, we didn't screw up anything. That's the right sequence. Mice are indeed protected. Followed shortly thereafter by the first clinical data in the phase 1, and that was now in May, where we demonstrated high levels of antibodies in people who've been vaccinated. And I think once we saw that, I and my team were very optimistic. I remember people asking me, "Well, what do you think the efficacy is going to be?" And I responded that 100's a good number for me. This thing's going to work quite well. Um, we didn't know how well, of course. This was the first clinical mRNA vaccine trial ever done. But having such high levels of antibodies that even exceeded the levels you saw in people who were sick with a virus was really, really reassuring. And I think that is the cornerstone of why our vaccine has been so effective.
Yeah. Israel and America and Israel and the rest of the world have been in this interesting dance during the pandemic where Israel has been giving us kind of a window into a few months ahead. You see into the future a little bit. And in the spring, that was really exciting. Now it feels a little ominous. In terms of how you're thinking, many people in the chat have asked us about boosters. I'm not surprised. In terms of how you see this next phase of the pandemic, what people call learning to live with the pandemic, how do you think the US can respond to what we have seen from Israel so far? And what do you think the next step is?
So let me try and break that apart a bit. Israel, I'm super proud. What the country has done, both with us and with Pfizer, in terms of being amongst the first to recognize the potential of mRNA vaccines and to commit to actually purchasing enough for the population ahead of knowing that this is going to work, I think was truly foresight. The way that the vaccination programs rolled out was truly remarkable. I remember being interviewed in German on a German TV station of all places, when they asked me, what can Israel teach Germany about how to roll out vaccines? And I basically said, it's hard to teach a lesson here when you're operating in a country that has been under existential threat since its inception. We know how to deal with existential threats. We muster up, and I think what you saw was a part of it, but it did take a lot of understanding, wisdom, and foresight and planning to get it done right initially. And for that, I applaud them. I think the team on the ground in Israel is truly, truly superb. Boosters. So there's been a couple of interesting learnings here. The first is that we probably declared victory a tad too soon, thinking that, a 1-2 punch was enough. There are many vaccines out there, and this is kind of basic immunology, where a prime and just one boost isn't optimal, and you come back at 6 months to give a third dose. We see that from hepatitis. Many of the pediatric vaccines are given over 3 doses, et cetera. And this is kind of basic immunology, right? You show something to the immune system once, okay, it clears it. You come back with a booster, well, it wakes up, it hasn't really cleared the problem. If you come back 6 months later, that thing you thought you cleared isn't really gone, then you continue to improve the immune response. And what it means is that your immune response comes up higher, stronger, it comes up faster, and it's going to be more durable. And that's how evolution has trained our immune system. Now, the initial data were so good after just 2 doses that we thought we solved the problem. And certainly we expected it to last for at least 6 months, if not a year or longer. And I think had the virus stayed the original virus in its overall infectivity, that may have been the case. But then along came Delta, right? And what did Delta teach us? Well, Delta is a mutation that the virus has evolved not really to escape the immune system. That's not why Delta has evolved. Delta has evolved, remember, it evolved in India in a place where people were not vaccinated. It evolved to be that much more infective. And so if you look at the way the immune system recognizes Delta, it recognizes it almost as well as it does the original strains. The difference, though, is that Delta can infect us so much more effectively and so much more efficiently that now, if the antibody levels have dropped, it can actually gain a foothold. So if I've been twice vaccinated and I walk down the street and somebody with Delta sneezes on me, the virus is so fast to attach itself and replicate that by the time my immune system wakes up and that recall comes in, the virus has already started to replicate, and I can transmit it to others, and I can even become sick. The good news is that I'm still pretty well protected against severe disease, because what's happened is there's an arms race going on in my body between the immune system ramping up and the virus trying to take over, right? And as long as I've been vaccinated twice, then we're still pretty well protected from severe disease. Now, all that means is that you would expect a third dose to be very effective, because if the difference is not really in the immune recognition, it's just in how fast the virus replicates, then if I can boost up the immune system, if I can improve my standing in that arms race, then I should be able to beat it back. And indeed, that's the case. We now have data from Israel showing that in adults over 60, as soon as they get the third dose, they again reach more than 90% of protection. And now I'm not just talking protection against severe disease, we're back to talking about protection against even mild disease. So I do think boosters are in the future, certainly for people who are immunocompromised, that was clear from the get-go. But also, I think for the rest of the population, you're going to see a recommendation for booster. Israel is already there vaccinating people above the age of 40. I think the UK is not far behind. And I think in the US, there's an expectation that starting in the second half of September, once FDA has a chance to look at the totality of data, there likely will be an approval for a booster shot in the US as well.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. A few people have dropped in questions about this, and it's actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about as well. I think one thing that this pandemic has done, especially to those of us who have not lived our whole lives in a country under existential threat, is raise the specter of fear in a way that people who have been privileged, who have lived in relative comfort, haven't experienced. And I think all of us are reconsidering our risk assessment, polishing off tools of evolution and human nature that we did not expect to need to use. For you, knowing everything that you know, having been so immersed in this, how has your sense of risk assessment and fear changed during the pandemic?
That's a fascinating question. So one of the things that's always been interesting to me is how we make decisions as human beings. It turns out that we're not as rational as we'd like to think. There's a great author and researcher by the name of uh, Dan Ariely who wrote a book a few years ago called "Predictably Irrational." So in some ways we're predictably so, but how we make decisions is really fascinating, and it's a complicated problem because risk is a continuous variable. You can have a little bit, a lot, a less, but the actions you take are often binary. You either do something or you don't. So for each of us, there comes a tipping point. Do I want to get vaccinated? Well, how big is the risk? How big is the benefit? What do I believe? But the decision to go get vaccinated is a binary. I either do it or I do not. I think for me personally, the benefit risk of the vaccines was always, crystal clear. I had anticipated it based on the phase 1 data, and certainly as soon as we could get ourselves vaccinated, that was an obvious thing to do. The other elements, I think, are more complicated. So the things that we do for vaccination, those are to protect ourselves and to protect friends and family and society. Well, what about mask wearing? And now we come into a really, interesting paradox, if you will, because we now know that this Delta, we're probably protected, but actually it's very infective and it's going to find people who aren't vaccinated. So do I wear a mask even though there's no risk to me to protect somebody who doesn't want to get vaccinated, right? Why should I give up my personal liberty of seeing the faces of my colleagues in the office for those people who think this is all a hoax and don't want to protect themselves when it's available? And it's become a much more complicated math, if you will. I think what it's taught me personally is first, you got to role model whatever behavior to protect the population you believe is the right one. And that's at a personal level, that's at a company level, whatever your social group is. I think at Moderna, we've gone back to wearing masks in the office, but now mandating vaccination for all employees, which we think is the right thing to do. But we also recognize that there are going to be people who are relatively under-vaccinated or people who can't get vaccinated. Of course, there's the pediatric population. And so we do need to do whatever we can to minimize the risk to the extent that we can. But I've sort of, I think, learned to respect a much wider spectrum of people's opinions and behaviors, because how you deal with this is very personal. And right now we see a gamut of behaviors in the US, and we're going to have to figure out how to live with all of them, right?
I'm impressed. You may be the one person who the pandemic has made them more accepting of a wider range of opinions from their fellow citizens. So that's kudos to you for that. I have found it hard to be so generous, but I'll try to model your behavior. I think something that we've seen in this country, and you were talking about Israel being so quick to understand the potential of mRNA vaccines, was this incredible buy-in from governments that sometimes, in the case of the US, take a more hands-off approach or don't tout these kinds of investments as readily as they have in this case. And that's continued, under 2 administrations. Being in the business of getting, these vaccines or other therapeutics out the door, what do you think a good working relationship between the industry and government looks like, so that, we can have more medical breakthroughs of this kind at the speed that we found, that this one came to the market?
Well, I think there's a couple of elements here. First, we're very fortunate in this country to have the FDA that we do. And, all of us take it for granted, but we really shouldn't, for 2 reasons. First, you have to realize that the amount of resources and talent that we muster as a society that's embodied in the FDA is quite unusual. I'll give you a simple example. When you go to the FDA and you say, hey, I think this thing works, the FDA says, yeah, I don't care what you think, show me the data. They run their own analysis. And then they say, we agree or we don't. You go to most other regulatory agencies and you say, hey, I think this thing works. They will either say, yeah, we don't agree. Can you analyze it this way or that way or the other way, right? They don't have the resources to do it themselves. And most of the rest of the world basically said, oh, the FDA approved it, that's good enough for us. And so the real heroes of the story of the last year were actually my colleagues at FDA, because remember, I was one company and I could always go hire other people overnight to come join the effort to try to do this, right? Well, they really couldn't hire and train people so fast, and they had to look at my data and Pfizer's data and J&J's data and, and 20 others, all with the world watching them on very, very tight timelines, because basically I came to them and said, okay, here's the data. Now the clock's on you and the world's looking at you. How quickly can you approve this? And so I am deeply, deeply grateful and have the utmost respect for how they handled it, to the point that I actually don't think, and I may be an outlier here, but I don't think the bottleneck of getting vaccines or drugs approved are regulatory agencies. I think the bottlenecks are actually being able to demonstrate the data to a sufficient standard. And once we have it, regulators move pretty quickly. Now, it's true that the resources aren't infinite, and in scrambling to meet the COVID needs, they begged, borrowed, and took resources from other areas. So obviously, we have to think carefully about the right level of funding and support for the FDA. But beyond that, one of the main reasons that we were able to move so quickly last year is because we had a lot of cases. And so when you run a very large trial, and the trial is geared to show a difference of your vaccine, and there is rampant infection in your population, you very quickly see the cases pile up. And when you tally up, you see they're all piling up on the placebo side. Okay, that's pretty clear this vaccine works. In most other areas of drug development and vaccine development, we actually have to wait for those cases to occur for us to be able to show a difference. And that's just how biology works. So it's very challenging actually to come to a conviction on a drug or a vaccine's ability to work if you can't show the clinical data for that. And it's not really a regulatory hurdle. That's just the natural history of most diseases and our ability to be able to show that data.
Right, this was so widespread, the sample size grew quite quickly. So having looked through the questions that people have for you, I would say there's sort of an overwhelming number of people who want to talk to you about breakthrough infections. Maybe we'll get to that. But there are also a few people who are interested in more about your family story. You talked a little bit about your family's coming to Israel. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that story of survival has affected the way you see your work and what you do?
So by way of history, my grandparents, all four of them immigrated from Poland in the 30s. And so both my parents are Israelis. I'm actually a second generation. It sort of hit me when my grandfather died. So typical secular household with very few, aunts and cousins, if you will, although I was already second generation. But when my grandfather died, on his tombstone in Haifa, he asked to inscribe all the names of his siblings and their direct descendants, because it's the only memory of their existence. And boy, is that a long list. And I remember at his unveiling of his tombstone, that sort of really hit home for me. On my wife's side, and you can see in the background, it's a print she made. She's an artist. Those are her grandparents at their wedding day. They were actual Holocaust survivors who then managed to come to Israel, find each other again after the war, and come to Israel. It's the only picture of them that they managed to keep through the war, and it's of their wedding day. But I'll tell you, when my family was growing up, my son always wanted to go back and serve in the army. And since he grew up in Jewish high school and he was always close to Israel, I remember at the age of 18, he was trying to convince me whether he should go back to serve or go to college. And of course, we wanted him to go to college first, and he wanted to serve. And at one point, I sat him down and I said, "Look, I'm not going to tell you not to go to Israel to serve in the army." And he kind of opened his eyes and said, "My grandfather, when he was 16, he left what his parents thought was right and history proved him right. Now, if you believe that your destiny is to go back and serve in the Army, all I can say is God be with you, and I wish you all the best, but it's your life to figure out. And so that's kind of, I think, I joke to people at Moderna. I've been with the company now a little over 6 years. The wandering Jew genotype now has to get expressed again, and it's time for me to wander a bit. But that search for having it an impact and doing it in a place where you can put your mark on the world, I think that's something that's ingrained in us culturally, and certainly as Israelis growing up in Israel, between the sense of needing to achieve and the sense of persecution, that's probably my heritage.
In terms of leaving your mark on the world, I think that's a question now that we, in places where we've been able to get vaccinated, we think a lot about people who aren't so lucky. And I think there has been, I'll speak for myself on a personal level, of feeling like a third shot offers me more protection. Like, sign me up. I'm ready to walk back to Mount Sinai, get my third dose. I couldn't want anything more than to resume that brief window of normalcy that we got over the summer, where we got to set aside that fear for a little bit. I'm also aware that there are people in countries clamoring for their first doses. Thinking about that, the amazing production that Moderna and Pfizer and these other vaccine companies have been able to ramp up, how do you think about equity and about what our responsibility is to the world, especially when, we have a self-interest in the world getting vaccinated, because that is what's going to help, stamp out other versions of this virus that could affect all of us?
It's a tough one. So, I go back to the Talmud, the poor of your people come first, right? And for me, there is a moral imperative to first take care of your own, not shirking the responsibility for the world. I think the way Moderna has tried to do it, and I'm super proud of it, has been to invest from day one at risk as much as we could to ramp up manufacturing as much as we could, and then work diligently with governments as representatives of their people to ensure that our supply could get as broad as possible in the world. Ultimately, there are political constraints to our ability to do that. And I think you've seen that play out on the world stage. Now, that being said, I have to say that this is where I'm actually impressed by your generation, and I see it in my kids. I think your generation is growing up in a world that is much more interconnected and has much more a sense of shared responsibility, probably. Certainly with the challenges that humanity now faces pretty much together, and the response to which continues to be without enough equity, probably, whether it's dealing with vaccine shortages or global warming, frankly. And that is going to be, I think, a legacy for your generation, Mattie.
Great. I'm super excited to solve that problem. I'll let you know when we figure that out. How long could it possibly take? There are a few people who want to know about Moderna seeking FDA approval, since you are extolling the virtue of your colleagues at the FDA, whether that is on the horizon, and whether that has any bearing on, the kinds of third doses that people get, whether they should be getting the same third dose that they got for doses 1 and 2.
So yes, it is on the horizon. We filed, I anticipate in due course, we will get the full approval as well. I don't think the filing per se has bearing on the answer. The answer is a scientific one. I think I expect the data to bear out the ability to cross boost with an mRNA vaccine, irrespective of what your first dose was. That's predicated both on simple scientific principles. An mRNA vaccine only shows the immune system that antigen very cleanly. And as I said from the outset, I think the similarities between the two mRNA vaccines far outweigh any differences. That's the first point. The second point is that there are actually emerging data. The UK has run some studies showing that you can prime with one and boost with another, and you actually get a pretty robust immune response. I believe the same will hold true for a third dose. There's no reason not to. but we're going to have to wait to see the data. So ultimately, I'm going to have to defer to the data and the regulators giving us the okay, but I anticipate that this is what will happen in the coming weeks and months.
We'll jump around a little bit now since questions are all over the place and I want to get to a good selection. Someone asked what your relationship to Israel is now. And we talked a little bit about how you shifted sort of in identity in moving to the States, but I'm curious when you go back, whether you feel a sense of homecoming or whether you have that eerie feeling of being like a tourist in your own homeland.
It's not a simple one, right? The U.S. has become my home. This is where my kids are. Yet, of course, Israel is where I grew up, and I feel an immense sense of debt and gratitude. Typically Israeli, when I go home, the first week is like, oh my God, this is great. The second week is, yeah, maybe not so. The third week is, why are you guys driving like crazy people? Get me out of here, right? So look, more seriously, I have to tell you, one of the greatest moments of my life was when we went back this April, to Tel Aviv, and we were having lunch in a restaurant outside. At the end of the meal, somebody stood up from the table next, came over and said, hey, are you that doctor that was on TV telling us everything was going to be okay? Can I shake your hand and say thank you? Because you were a voice for optimism at a time that we thought we really had a dark future here. And I have to tell you, on a personal level, that was super heartwarming. More to the point, I think you're going to see me try and find ways to give back to the state of Israel from my professional perch, as a drug developer. I have that sense of, I think, both gratitude and responsibility to give back, and I will find ways to do so.
I'm struck by actually the thing that you just said, because I think when I've talked to scientists before, particularly vis-a-vis the pandemic and vaccine development, there's this strange combination that you just spoke to, which is you are a group of people who are always looking to be proven wrong in data and to question your own hypotheses, but you also have this optimism and this hope for what medicine can achieve, kind of in the short term, relatively speaking. It all happened really quickly. That balance for you of being realistic, of second guessing yourself, but also of having hope, how do you stay in that place? I think a lot of us find it hard to be realists and be optimists at the same time.
It's a great question. I think I'm very fortunate because I probably live at the edge of one of the greatest imbalances that anybody can imagine. I mean, look at the outset. I come from a Talmudic heritage, which is every question is why not, right? So you argue. I'm a medical oncologist, which means that when patients come to see me, often it's a tough conversation, and it's hard to be optimistic many times, unfortunately, still. I grew up in a scientific tradition that challenges every assumption, as you said, right? Nothing is proven right until you try to disprove it 5 times over, and if it's still standing, then it's probably true. Okay, that's a lot of pessimism stacked up right there. On the flip side, we live in an era of such phenomenal, profound, and rapid scientific development and technological innovations that are just beautiful. And being able to be at the forefront of where you can see them emerge from the lab, from the technologies that people are developing, and see them applied to make a difference in people's life, how can you not be optimistic when you see the impact that we're actually able to deliver?
It's hopeful. It definitely feels, contrary to so much other news, hopeful. I'm curious how you're going to feel when the time comes for you to be outside of this system that you've been so immersed in, to watch some of these developments happen, not from your current job. People are curious to know what your next career move is. We will wait to hear if you pick up any hobbies, but I'm also interested to know how you just feel about seeing things a little bit more from the outside, and how much you want to keep your hand in the development of these next therapeutics.
So I'll tell you, Mattie, one of the most profound realizations for me over the past year was the importance of perspective. You know, there was a point when we were running so fast that I had to disconnect on Saturdays. And it was about 7 or 8 weeks in. We worked 24/7. You know, when there's life at stake, there's no Sabbath, right? Well, I just had to give my mind a rest. And I realized when I disconnect on Saturdays, it's not for religious purposes, but by God, there's a reason people do that, or God commanded it, whichever you believe, which is by the time the end of the day rolled in, I could actually think clearly about the week ahead and forget the immediate and figure out what was important. And it taught me that without perspective, you often sacrifice what's important for what's urgent or what's immediate. And so taken back at a macro level, now for me personally, this is a wonderful opportunity that life has afforded me to step back and really reimagine my own personal perspective. So you won't see me, leave. I'm not going to go and disappear from this cutting edge of translating science into medicine. That's still going to remain my passion. But I do need some time to re-engage to figure out my perspective. For the last 6-7 years, I've been immersed in messenger RNA sciences. I'm really curious, where's the frontier of medicine gone to in other, it's a very wide and broad frontier. And I'm just curious to step back and understand what are other areas there and how else can I be effective and involved. So I'm going to go satisfy my curiosity, and I'm going to take some time to figure out a different perspective on it before I re-engage again with the same level of intensity.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you on that note, you must now be at the point where, after having asked people for advice for many years, people now ask you for advice. And I'm sure people who are interested in this field and people who are just working in the fields of science and medicine in general come to you and ask for your advice. What is the piece of advice that you find yourself doling out most frequently?
Make sure that you are asking the important questions, that you're devoting your time to the stuff that really matters to you. That's it.
And how do people figure that out if they're not sure? What is that thing that is motivating them and driving them?
Well, as Yogi Berra said, when you see a fork in the road, take it.
What a perfect note to end on. I think that we've covered many questions, although there is no shortage of information that you could give out about the third dose if you wanted to. But we'll leave that to the epidemiologist to share. And I just want to thank you so much for doing this. It's been such a pleasure.
Mattie, the pleasure's been mine. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Tal and Mattie, for this really informative and really amazing conversation. It's been a pleasure to listen to.
The pleasure's mine. Thanks for hosting us.
I echo Sydney's thanks, and great thanks to Mark Kirshner and Nancy Fisher, whose generosity makes our Legacies program possible. It really is pretty exciting to have heard from Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla in February, and you today, Tal, and to think about all the amazing ways that the stories that we tell and preserve at the museum are intertwined with the most important things happening in the world today. So you've given us a lot to think about. All that we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. So to those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member, and certainly joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the links in the Zoom chat. We wish everyone a great evening. We hope you get vaccinated if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.